All right, so today I'm here with the one and only Michael Libertini. But the reason for this video is literally to get down and dirty on all things investment properties. So we get a lot of calls, a lot of inquiries about people who want to buy an investment property here in Hawaii. And there's a lot of things you need to know before you dive into that world. So quick backstory, Michael, your background, 11 years plus in the retail banking space. And then you jumped into the mortgage world, done 15 deals personally on the investment side and helped over 100 clients. So he knows what he's talking about, if that's all that needs to be said. But let's kind of jump into the big one, which is just leasehold versus fee simple in Hawaii. I think that's the number one thing. We see a sticker price on Zillow and it's like $80,000. We're like, oh, this is a great one. I can cash flow, right? So what is that difference?
Yeah, so first, you have to think about what is leasehold property, right? So leasehold property is the situation where you have a apartment structure or a building built on a set of land that is owned by another party. So typically what you see on the mainland or even most of the apartments that exist here in Hawaii is that the owner of the land as well as the building are the same person, right? It's the association. And so when they say fee simple, that means that you're buying a fractional piece of that building along with the unit itself. Whereas on a leasehold property, you're buying only the unit itself and you're paying lease rent to the landowner.
Yes. And we've also always got HOAs on condos, which people don't realize is like paradise tax in Hawaii. But on a leasehold, you're going to see HOA and lease rent. And so when you're comparing a fee simple mortgage versus a lease rent, sometimes it can be the same. And sometimes the leasehold can even be more on a monthly basis, right? So there's a lot people need to understand when it goes into that.
I think what you'll find is that on fee simple, since the price of paradise is so high, that the price on the absolute price of the sale of condos is usually much higher than a leasehold property, which is why leasehold looks so attractive, but you got to read the fine print. Understanding what that fine print means is typically there's an expiry date on that particular lease. Do you know what happens to a building if that lease expires?
I think it goes either up again for fee simple or they renegotiate the lease and reset the clock basically, right?
Correct. So 9 times out of 10, you'll find, some sort of family that owns a lease that is receiving lease rent, and then the developer built the apartment building and then is obviously selling them out to prospective buyers. Sometimes there'll be an instance where the family goes, we don't want to own this anymore. We just want to sell it to the association.
Okay.
Well, if the association doesn't have the wherewithal or finances to buy that fee, then they have to either give the building back or go to the owners and say, this is how much it's going to cost each one of us in order for us to stay in our apartments. Leasehold can have some teeth to it where it makes it a little bit more risky, especially when you're talking about investment properties.
Totally. And that's what we always just advise our clients is like, yes, this looks great on paper, but we have to know the full circle, right? So realizing like, okay, it's got 8 years left and it's $12,000. Is this a good deal? And that's what we're going to talk about today is like, how do you analyze that on paper? And how do you look just even scanning a Zillow property, what are you looking for, right? Ideally, we're scrolling all the way down to see the nitty gritty. And I think a lot of people just see the sticker price and then they inquire on it. And then we're doing a lot of education on the back end to get them up to speed. But I guess let's break it down of like, what do you need to get started, right? So all I need as a realtor is like, what's your price range, what's your area, and what's your timeline? Those are the big 3 I need, but you need a lot more on the financing side, right? Are we getting cash? Are we getting a loan? Like, walk me through that.
When thinking about loans and investment in general, you want to leverage because that allows you to buy many more properties, right? As opposed to having all of your cash or equity going into one particular property. So the banks are smart, right? So they go, hey, this is not a first-time homebuyer program. We're not going to give you 3% down or anything like that. We're actually going to require 20 to 25% down on most. And on leasehold properties specifically, it goes up to 35% because it adds an extra layer of risk, right? So when evaluating the numbers, and we're going to get to that into it just a second, you have to think, am I as an investor looking for a rate of return in the form of appreciation? Or am I looking for cash flow? Do you know the difference between the two?
Yep. So fun fact that I always advise on too is that Hawaii is an appreciation state. We're not necessarily a cash flow state like Texas, where you buy something at $200,000 and you're getting instant cash flow on that rent. But really it's the long-term buy and hold. And so realizing that our market tends to double every 10 to 12 years, which is super exciting, but seeing that on the data absolutely is really important. So when we do a buyer's consult, we're going over that. We're going through all the data and the charts so you guys understand. But yeah, absolutely.
In a nutshell, or simply made, is that if I buy, say, a a 1-bedroom apartment, right? If the typical rate of return is say 5 to 7% a year, I'm looking to get a renter into that investment property to at least cover my expenses, right? Hopefully not having too large of a delta in between what I'm receiving and what I'm paying. And then I use that 5% on, let's just say, a $500,000 property. $25,000 a year is being added to my appreciation. If I have a cash flow of net zero, that's the appreciation or the appreciation state that you referenced earlier. Whereas a cash flow is almost the complete opposite. Where you have a leasehold property, a lot of times that appreciation is capped somewhat because there could be an expiry date where I either have to give the unit back or whatever it is, right? So in this instance, you're actually looking, how much money can I aggregate as much possible per month in order to make it a smart investment? So leasehold properties typically reside in what we call resort zoning. What is resort zoning?
So in Hawaii, we get a lot of inquiries too about people who want a short-term rental, right? It's paradise. Like, we vacation here twice a year. We might as well buy something. Let's get a short-term rental. Well, the state of Hawaii has gotten really strict and cracked down on that, and it has to be resort zoning. So that's limited to Waikiki, Turtle Bay, Ko'olina, a little bit of Makaha. That's it, right? Just those four. Anything outside of that, and in Waikiki, it's Kuhio and below, right? Kuhio Avenue and below. Anything outside of that is like grandfathered in, meaning they got in and they got that nuclear license for short-term before all the crackdown and COVID, or they're just operating illegally, which happens a lot. So that's kind of like, definitely need to know that.
Yeah, and so it's important to draw the distinction that, you know, the minimum rental period for any unit that is not in a resort zoning is 30 days plus, right? And so that doesn't really in lines with the typical vacationer. They're usually coming here for 7 days or anything like that. So it's harder to cash flow a property in that. But getting back to the numbers, and we're gonna go through an example in just a second, is that, you know, instead of getting a long-term lease, which may be, you know, $1,800, $2,500 a month, you can get $200 a day just by being able to rent on a short term, but it got to be done the legal way.
Yep, exactly. And those prices are going to be premium for those legal short-term rentals. But again, if the numbers make sense, it could make sense. But going back to the cash flow versus appreciation, it's like, it's a totally, completely different mindset. And so when you tell someone, okay, we're going to buy in Hawaii and you're going to make no money every month, people are like, what? You're an idiot. Like, why would I do that, right? But there is absolute gain there. It's just having faith in the market, understanding our data. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's say we found a property. They're going to send it to me. They'll say, Marina, this looks great. What do we think? I'm going to have first look at it. But there's a filter we can kind of go through before we even reach out to you. Like, help us build that filter a little bit.
Yeah, so going through the numbers on something like a typical leasehold property in Hawaii, I've just kind of put it into Excel, our handy dandy spreadsheet. But if we were looking at a property, let's say in the $250,000 range, typically, like I mentioned, it could be as high as 35% for the down payment requirement, right? So people that want to get into Hawaii, they got to know that, hey, what is 35% of 250,000? That's 87,500. So for many people, that may be something that's a little bit out of reach for them. So they might want to look at a different type of property, or even something like you mentioned, there's leaseholds as cheap as $80,000. And, you know, 35% on there is still much lower than, say, 250,000. But for example's sake, we're going to go through this. Now, that leaves $162,500 for a loan amount or a mortgage, okay? Now, if we typically do a mortgage somewhere in here, you know, principal and interest payment is gonna run you right around $1,600, $1,632. But we have other expenses involved in that, right? So your taxes on the property, they can be anywhere from 85 to like 150, just depending on the classification of the property. We're gonna have insurance. So something on the insurance is that the association typically has an insurance policy, but anything inside the property is called a walls in or an HO6 policy. Relatively cheap, but it's still a requirement, especially if you're gonna have a loan against it. It's gonna be about $35 a month.
Quick question. If you're gonna make it a short-term rental or an investment property, is insurance higher?
Can be. So it really depends on the fixtures and things that you have inside the property. So if I have brand new koa wood floors and some, you know, custom cabinetry, and you're having people use it, you know, pretty regularly, could be a little bit more, but leave the insurance guys to kind of assess that for you.
Because that's not bad, 35 bucks.
No. This is the real big one here. So the maintenance fee is really going to dictate a lot of the investment hot buttons of what we like to call is, because if the carry costs are just too high, no matter what you rent it for, you may not be able to eclipse that. So for a 1-bedroom apartment, I'm gonna think about under 500 square feet. That's a pretty typical leasehold. They can find them as small as 300 square feet. But the maintenance fee is gonna be well over $1 a square foot, right? And so for the leasehold and the lease rent that is included inside of there, you're probably gonna be paying upwards of around $700 a month could be quite a bit more as well.
And what does that get someone? They're always like, why am I paying $700, right?
And it varies from building to building. I mean, some of the luxury stuff that you kind of see in, you know, in Waikiki and in Kaka'ako, you know, you'll see properties that offer full-on pools, theater centers, chef's kitchens, all that kind of stuff. But typically on the leasehold properties, because they're older buildings, they're actually paying for a lot of deferred maintenance projects, you know, spalling, they got, you know, salt in the air they have to deal with, right? Plumbing stuff, sprinkler systems, all that kind of stuff that gets involved inside of there. So the maintenance fee actually gets pushed up, even though you're not getting that many amenities. So they may not have a pool. They may only have one parking. They may not have that much in terms of landscape or anything, but the costs are still high, right? So when we look at that and the total figure, you're looking around $2,400, $2,500 a month. Now, to an average investor, you're like, I can do that, right? Like that seems doable, right? Let's just say we looked at it from a long-term rent perspective.
Okay.
Let's just say in that area, it's fetching about $1,900, okay? You're looking at a delta of $552 a month.
Yeah, now, delta meaning you're losing money.
Correct. Now, the difference in that is that typically, like we were talking about before, if it was a $500,000 piece of property and you're, you know, earning 5% in appreciation, you're going, hey, I'm paying $500 a month, that's $6,000 a year, but I'm making $25,000 on appreciation. Makes sense. Well, in this case, on a leasehold property, like we mentioned, it's a $250,000 property, and probably the appreciation is going to be capped somewhere where it's probably like maybe 1% a year. So now at 1% of 250, that's $2,500. You're losing money on this deal, right? Not to mention there's all different types of variable costs that can come into play here, and the upside begins to look pretty bleak. So then you take the leasehold property and you're like, oh, it's in resort zoned, means I can short-term vacation rental this. There's a couple things to consider there. A lot of the leasehold properties that are available may have a management company on site that will be able to help you to clean the property, to get it ready for the next guest. But they take a healthy chunk of that nightly rate out of there. It could be as upwards of 40% of the nightly rate. So if you're having a $200 nightly fee and then 40% of that's going straight to management and cleaning, right? You're not left with a whole bunch at the end of the day, maybe 120 bucks. And when we look at the expense side of things, it may not be a viable option. But there's also a middle tier one where you could have, you know, a third party company come manage it for you for a lot less money, but they may not be as invested as you are to making it happen. Or there's a good old sweat equity where you can actually manage it yourself. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that, right? Like you're gonna have to make sure that if I have a full-time job, can I manage all of the bookings, everything like that? But you can save a lot of those costs and make homeownership a possibility for you. But to your example, there's, you know, people on the mainland that may be looking to do this. They're gonna go, I'm gonna have to bake in those expenses into my calculation to make sure that this works.
Absolutely. Real quick, explain how a hotel pool works. Like if it's in the pool, what does that mean?
Right, so if you enter your unit into a hotel pool or a condotel or whatever it is that they will actually market your unit for you. They will clean your unit for you. They will prepare, and you will have accessibility to any of the amenities that they have on property. Whereas if you're outside of that hotel pool, then you're responsible for doing it all on your own, and people might not understand the differences or distinctions with there. So there's some services and some pluses that come along with it, but there's also some expense.
Okay, and then I've heard too, even if it's in a hotel pool, sometimes you don't get to pick what date you want for yourself personally. Like it's literally up to the internet, you know? And that kind of sucks. Right.
And so I think for people that are maybe wanting to do this remotely, it may not be the most opportune way to do business, especially if you're planning to come here for a number of times. It really is a case-by-case basis where you have to do your due diligence to make sure as a potential investor, read the fine print, or find a team that will read it for you and know what they're talking about. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, okay, now I want to manage it myself, right? I'm gonna do the Airbnb operator. This is what I wanna do to kind of make this a reality. Well, typically we use a vacancy rate of about 22 days a month. What that means is out of a 30-day month, we're gonna guess that maybe 8 of those days are not gonna be rented, right? Whether it be you have an incoming person and you know you're just going by weeks or everything like that, but we're gonna go use 22 days as that it's gonna be fully rented. Let's just say, like we use an example, that's $200 a day, a nightly rate. That's gonna yield you $4,400. You're like, hey, that sounds pretty good, right? And so you can annualize that. I mean, that's almost $50,000 of income, right? You're like, wow, that's a home run, right? Well, what are the expenses on it? So if I had, someone cleaning my unit, let's just say I had 10%, of a month that I would be paying for cleaners. Let's just say all of the local taxes, GET, transient accommodation tax, and even your regular business taxes. Let's just say it averages out to about 15%, right? Less the mortgage we talked about, which is up here where you still have to pay all of those fees. We're gonna end up at a monthly income amount of only $848. Okay. Now, if I were to annualize that, that's $10,000 a year.
Which is nice.
Which is nice, right? That's net profit, right? But that's on the assumption of $22 or 22 days a month at $200 a night. If you're going, wait, that's a far cry from the $50,000 of gross income. That's going to be your net profit. And that's how we calculate things like cap rate. That's a metric that a lot of investors use, and we can get into that in a different episode. But getting to your net operating income per year is really what investors' first step into being to evaluate properties and making sense of them. Because as much as the home buying process is an emotional thing when you're buying it for yourself, typically it has to be an objective process when you're doing it as an investor. So what you start doing is you start looking at these pro formas more closely than the amenities, even though on the thing. Now, on the particular units, you're looking at condition, right? You're making sure they don't have a lot of deferred maintenance issues. But what we've seen a lot, and I think we've talked about this before, is that many times what looks attractive to an investor are low maintenance fees, low lease rents, and all that kind of stuff. That could be a landmine sometimes because it could mean that the actual association has taken maybe a backseat approach to some of the maintenance issues that are going on. And if you take a look at inflation and what's happened over the course of the last few years, how can an association keep their maintenance fees the same when everything else, the price of goods are going up? Right?
It's impossible.
It doesn't make sense. So what you do want to see is a pretty proactive approach by the association to increase maintenance fees judiciously. And like, it's not to say that you need to go up 15% every year.
No.
But you should be going up at a healthier clip because it's just the cost of doing business. If you do find yourself in a situation where you're like, this looks really good on paper, probably do your double, triple checks just to make sure that there's nothing right. One of the things that I used to work with once upon a time in a previous life is that we would actually do what we call association loans. And so homeowners associations would come to banks.
Like assessment stuff?
Kind of like that. So let's just say that you're in a building, it's 40 years old, and all of a sudden, we need a new parking structure or a driveway, right? And you're going, we don't have the funds inside our reserve account just to pay for it. What do? Well, you either special assess all of your owners. What does that do to home value? Right? So if you're seeing a unit like for like, and it's all of a sudden that value starts going down, you're like, oh man, like I don't really want to buy into there because then it's going to hinder my resale value. Well, what they'll do is they'll come to banks and they'll be able to amortize that improvement over, let's say, 20 to 30 years.
Okay, that's good.
When that happens, it's only a moderate increase to the maintenance fees and not an assessment. And by doing so, increases property values because you get the benefit of the improvement, but not having to pay for it all at once. That's kind of how the numbers work. So as investors are going to evaluate those things, they should be looking at like, okay, does this property need something? And if it does, is it going to be a big ticket item? Roofs, plumbing, driveways, all expensive ticket items, right? If it's they need paint or they need to trim the trees, right? Not a big expense, but those bigger ticket item expenses could really change how you look at a property and if it's going to be a worthwhile investment or your time horizon. So sometimes you'd be like, hey, I want to get in and out. I want to own it for 3 years, cash flow it, and then move on to the next one. Completely possible, okay. But again, change the dynamic of how you're looking at investment
100%.
properties.
And just something to note too. So whenever we get into contract, we're looking at all the condo docs. During COVID, we couldn't get access to minutes because they weren't even meeting. Like the board wasn't getting together for 2 years. And so everything was outdated. We had no idea what was updated and what was really going on. But that's our job as agents and lender, is to do all the fact finding for our clients. And so when you're not here, boots on ground, I'm your eyes, your ears, I'm doing virtual tours. Like that is my job. Absolutely.
Yeah. Having a supportive team, especially if you're doing this remotely, can be really the decision factor between going forward with an investment or not going forward with an investment. So check with your local real estate team, especially someone as coast town to his marina, and then she'll be able to do all those checks for you, and then have a trusted lender be able to kind of do their analysis for you to go, hey, does this make sense? They're not necessarily going to make the decision for you, but they'll illuminate maybe some things you weren't thinking about to help you make that decision with both eyes open.
Which, just going back to expenses, like this seems really conservative to say $440 for cleaning a month.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, everything's just inflated in Hawaii. So realize that what you pay in the mainland is totally not what you're going to pay here. Everything is just more.
Or we can get the rubber gloves out, we can clean it ourselves.
We can totally do $400 of cleaning supplies. Yeah.
I'll raise my hand, right? Go clean.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think this is super helpful just to have a visual, because so many times we think we know what we're doing, or we watch a podcast or a YouTube video and they're like, oh, I should invest in Hawaii, right? It's a dream paradise location. Yep. We look at the numbers, it doesn't always make sense for someone. So maybe give an example of like, who do you see that's successfully investing today, and what does their background look like, or what makes a good investor?
Okay, so you hear a lot of buzzwords and things that happen inside of our marketplace on a national level and even locally. You hear about this thing called BRRRR, right? What does BRRRR mean? So it's buy, rehab, rent, repeat, right? So the idea behind something like that is to add value to a particular property. So many of the investors that I think that have done well for themselves have stayed really disciplined on their numbers and being objectivity on the yield of the investment. They put together solid teams of people that have their eyes and ears to look for those potential opportunities that come their way, even ones that don't hit the market. A lot of times, the best investors are the ones that have boots on the ground to bring them opportunities that would never come to them otherwise, right? And then the last part is that if they have access, whether through you or through someone else, a good construction team, is that they can do a very light or modest renovation, and there's a lot of creative ways to do that, that increases that nightly rate from say 200 to 225 or 250. Well, all of a sudden that creates $500 to $1,000 more inside of your monthly income, and then now that investment looks worthwhile. So you got to think about diamonds in the rough. You know, buying the smallest house in the nicest block, right? That principle still applies. It's where people get emotional that I think that they go, I love this property, our family would love it, it'll cash flow, it'll promise. And then all of a sudden they made an emotional decision, not an objective one, and they find themselves in hot water. So most of the people stay super disciplined to all of their numbers and the objectivity. They have a good team that they're able to help them with. They typically find themselves in properties that can add value, which will increase that nightly rate. Yeah, okay, that's great. Quick question I wanted to ask. So with leasehold, a lot of the time, the terms are less than 20 years before it expires, right? So talk to me about financing. Like, is there a loan limit? Like, what does that look like? So in typical leasehold land, most lenders require 5 years in addition to the term of the loan on the lease in order for them to underwrite. So give you an example. If you have 20 years left on a lease, that means we can only do a 15-year mortgage, right? So you're like, 15-year mortgage, what is that gonna do to the payment? Well, similar to any of these investments or anything like that, is that if the increase amount monthly, then you have to increase your nightly rent. And if it doesn't yield, it may be a very easy decision. I can't get financing on this, or the financing is not attractive. And yet the monthly yield is not going to be worth it. So what I've seen some people do is that they've been able to take out equity, say from their personal residence, right? Buy it cash. They don't have to have that. They're still leveraging, but they're leveraging their home in order to get inside of the investment space, which makes it possible. Okay, and usually that's through a HELOC or through a cash out refinance? In 6-12 months ago, it was almost all exclusively HELOCs, but if you've been paying attention what's happening in regional banks inside of the United States, is that they're having liquidity issues. So what that means is their portfolio or their actual funds that they have, not Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, investor funds, their own funds, it's getting more expensive. So you're starting to see an uptick in interest rates for HELOCs. And so it's not as attractive. Whereas a cash out refinance may be. But if you were one of those lucky ones that got a 3% mortgage in 2020, 2021, you may not want to touch that, right? So in that case, you may have to adjust your numbers to what the prevailing rates are, because why would you change your personal financial picture, right, to subsidize 100%. Your investment? So there's a lot of things we got to evaluate. There's a lot of decisions to make. It gets overwhelming. And a lot of the times I think people are very emotionally excited, and then we start to tell them all the things and it's that womp womp. But there's a lot that you just have to understand, and a lot of education that goes into it. And that's
that's our job. That's our job, to advise, to talk from personal experience and also our clients' experiences, and just market data, right? So you already have an eye 6 months, 12 out in the future. So do I, but we don't have crystal balls, right? We have expectations, but we don't know that the market's actually going to respond like we think it will. But there's always an optimistic side and there's opportunity everywhere. And I think that's where investing gets really excited, when you can have that outlook, right? Okay, this was super great. Do you feel like we missed anything that we should bring up?
I think that, we could probably have a 3-hour conversation about investing inside of Hawaii. But in terms of initial analysis of investment properties here in Hawaii, understanding the distinction between fee simple and leasehold, and then going to long-term rent versus short-term rent, I think those are probably the most popular types of topics to talk about now. And we're happy to have, subsequent conversations. So if your viewers want to leave comments inside of the description, we can kind
ask
of
all the
answer.
questions.
Exactly. And we'd be happy to answer them.
Totally. Yep. So the best way to contact you is your email, which is michael.libertini@hmdg.direct, and we'll type that in the text. And then Instagram @Libertini Home Loans is the place to be. He's a super cool guy. He surfs, he swims, all the things, canoes. And then for me, just email me, marina.tolentino@exprealty.com. We'll be sure to connect you guys. We always do Zoom calls is a great way to get started, just for level 1 conversation. Start the pre-approval process if that's what makes sense. And then I'll set up that home search so we can get to see what's on the market. Fun fact, I just Googled, I looked on the market. There's 75 active on the MLS right now, under 200,000 that are all leaseholds. And so that's a lot of inventory when you start to think about that. But out of that 75, how many are actually good investments? We don't know till we look, but it's kind of, who knows? It's exciting. I think, if you were to do an analysis on all 70, I bet you more than half aren't going to pencil out to maybe something that you're willing to do. But the good news is that there's available inventory and people are wanting to get involved. We should do at least some case studies just to make sure that you get your gears turning on what is a good investment versus not. We talked before about what I call the spidey senses, right? So being able to really assess early on, do I have someone that's, that really wants to do investment here, or I got a looky-loo, they're just getting their feet wet, just trying to understand the marketplace. And so we can do both of those things for them. 100%. And we've got a lot of Canadians out there too that message me, so thanks to the Canadians. But we know you guys are retiring, and that's the big thing, and they want tropical a property to hang out in. We'd mentioned the KAHALA one. You want to talk about that real quick? Yeah,
so the KAHALA Beach Apartments are an apartment complex located just next door to the actual hotel and resort. It's changed hands over a number of times, but recently their leasehold is expiring. Now, KAHALA Beach Apartments are located they're called on the beach. They're literally on the beach, right? They're beautiful real estate, very large units, but you could pick one up for $100,000 right now. Why? Right? These are probably multi-million-dollar units, each one of them. Why can you pick one up for $100,000? Well, their lease is expiring in 4 years, right? And they're not renewing it, right? And so you're able to buy it as a leasehold property. I mean, a fee simple property if you so do. But any guesses on the lease fee?
Well, you just told me, but I knew it would be over $1 million for sure.
It's about $2.5 million per unit, right? And so even if you own the structure at $100,000, to be able to buy that out, you have to fork out another $2.5 million. So it gives you a little bit of perspective on some of the leasehold properties that are existing in Hawaii, and they can range anywhere from a small, modest $200,000 lease fee to all the way up to $2.5 million. So it can vary quite a bit.
And just for general investors, usually if it looks too good to be true, it is. And so it's our job to help you understand that, get all the details so you guys can make it a good decision. Well, thank you so much for your time. You're a busy man, and I really appreciate it. And I'm excited we can help more people. I think this video is super educational, really just breaks it down and a lot of myths about investing in Hawaii anyways. Drop it in the comments if you guys have questions, and we'll go from there. Thank you. Good job.
Good job for you. You're the talent. I'm just here.